My dad drove off without me. 15 years later, he regrets it. Before we begin the story, take a moment to support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Your support means the world to our channel and helps us spread more shocking true stories to light. Now, let's get started. That summer, I turned 22. It was supposed to be just another ordinary year. Working shifts at my dad's hardware store, living at home because college wasn't practical, at least according to my father, Marshall. And, of course, playing the role I was born into, the family's designated punching bag. We weren't poor, but we weren't the kind of family that took vacations either. So when my father suddenly announced we were going on a road trip to my uncle's wedding in Colorado, I should have known something was off. 3 days into that miserable trip, I already regretted not finding some excuse to stay home. Dad and my brother, Jacob, had been keeping themselves entertained with their favorite pastime, making my life hell. My mother, Linda, would chime in every so often with a week, "That's enough," but we all knew it meant nothing. She never stopped them. She never would. That morning, we pulled into a deserted rest stop in the middle of nowhere. I was stiff from sleeping in the cramped back seat of our Suburban, so I decided to stretch my legs and use the bathroom. As I walked inside, they were laughing about something, and Mom was checking her makeup in the visor mirror. I didn't think much of it. I remember exactly what I was wearing: my faded Metallica t-shirt, ripped jeans, and my old beaten-up Vans. My phone was charging in the car. My wallet? Didn't bring it. I mean, why would I? We were in the middle of nowhere. I was just going to take a quick piss. I was in the bathroom for maybe 10 minutes. Maybe less. When I stepped back outside, squinting against the bright Colorado sun, the parking spot where our Suburban had been was empty. They were gone. At first, I thought they'd just moved the car. Some kind of dumb joke. I walked around the entire rest stop. Nothing. No sign of them. That's the thing about betrayal when it comes from your own blood. It doesn't just hurt. It redefines everything you thought you knew about the people who were supposed to love you. I sat on the curb for an hour, telling myself they'd be back any second, that they were just trying to scare me. Then 2 hours passed. A few travelers came and went, giving me strange looks. A trucker even asked if I was okay. I forced a smile and lied, told him I was just waiting for my girlfriend. But deep down I knew they weren't coming back, and I had a decision to make. Left for dead, but I refused to beg. Panic settled in slowly, creeping up my spine like ice water. My first instinct: borrow a phone, call them, beg them to come back. I scanned the parking lot and spotted a woman with 2 kids heading toward her car. My feet moved before I could second-guess myself. But then I stopped. A lifetime of memories flashed through my mind. Every cruel joke, every insult disguised as teasing, every time I was reminded that I was nothing to them. I could almost hear Jacob's smug voice. "Dude, I bet he's crying right now." My father, laughing. "He'll figure it out, if he's not as stupid as he looks." And my mother's weak, half-hearted attempt at protest. Words that never changed anything. Something inside me shifted. I walked up to the woman anyway, but I didn't call my family. Instead, I asked for the number of the nearest shelter. She hesitated, eyes scanning me for signs of danger, but I must have looked harmless enough, just a lost kid in a Metallica t-shirt. After a moment, she nodded and handed me her phone. I dialed information, got the number for a shelter in Grand Junction, about 40 miles away. Then I asked her for a ride. I told her my family had an emergency and had to leave, but they were sending someone to pick me up later. She didn't fully believe me. I could see it in her face, but she let me into her car anyway. That 40-minute ride was the longest of my life. I stared out the window, the mountains in the distance a blur, my stomach hollow. I wasn't thinking about how I'd survive. I wasn't thinking about what came next. I was just thinking, they really left me, starting over with nothing. The shelter wasn't much. Just a small building tucked between 2 other rundown places on a side street I'd never remember the name of. The guy at the front desk, Dave, took one look at me and sighed like he'd seen my story 1,000 times before. "What's your name, kid?" I hesitated. My last name felt like dead weight. "Sal." He nodded like he knew it wasn't the whole truth, but he didn't press. I had nothing, no ID, no money, no backup plan. Just the clothes on my back and a sinking realization that no one was coming to save me. Dave let me use the shelter's computer. My first instinct had been to try and find my uncle's address, show up at the wedding, and force my family to acknowledge me. But then I stopped. Why? Why chase after people who literally abandoned me on the side of the road for laughs? So instead, I opened a new email account. I looked up emergency ID replacements. I Googled jobs that paid cash. I made a plan. 2 days later, I walked into a small, greasy little diner called Sonny's and asked if they needed help. The owner, Geraldine, was in her 60s, purple-streaked gray hair, arms covered in faded tattoos, and an expression that said she had no patience for bullshit. "Our dishwasher quit yesterday," she said, sizing me up. "You steal from me, you're dead. Start now." And just like that, I had a job. The first call. For a week, I worked doubles. I crashed at the shelter, wearing donated clothes, scrubbing dishes until my hands were raw. Dave helped me start the process of getting a new ID. My first paycheck went straight to a cheap prepaid phone from Walmart. And then, 7 days after my family abandoned me, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. A shaky voice on the other end. "Sal? Oh my God, where are you?" It was my mother. They'd been looking everywhere. It was all just a joke. They swore they came back for me, but couldn't find me. I sat there listening to her frantic words, my grip on the phone tightening. In the background, I heard my father's irritated voice. "Tell him to stop being dramatic and get his ass to Uncle Rick's." And Jacob, laughing. "Dude, I bet he's still crying." I exhaled slowly. That cold, empty feeling in my gut, it was gone. All that remained was clarity. "You wanted to see if I could make it on my own," I said, voice steadier than it had ever been. "So watch me." I hung up. Then I blocked their numbers. Every single one I could remember. For good measure, the next day, I went to a Verizon store and changed my number completely. Before I did, though, I checked my missed calls. 27. I imagined their frustration, their growing anger when they realized I wasn't coming back. And for the first time in my life, I smiled, building a life from scratch. A month later, I had my own studio apartment above a laundromat. It was tiny, smelled like fabric softener. The walls were thin, and I could hear my neighbor's TV every night. But it was mine. Geraldine promoted me from dishwasher to prep cook. She even started teaching me how to actually cook, how to hold a knife without cutting my fingers off, how to make a sauce that didn't taste like regret. And every once in a while, I checked my old email. Messages from my mother. "Please come home. We're sorry." From my father. "This childish stunt needs to end now." From Jacob. "Dude, it was just a joke. Stop being such a..." I never responded. Not once. That's the thing about freedom. Once you taste it, there's no going back to the cage. Let me know if you want me to continue with the next part. Ban da noi? Continue. Chat da noi? 5 years later, karma came knocking. I won't pretend it was easy. Some nights I scrolled through Instagram, seeing people with families who actually loved them, and felt that familiar ache. A void no amount of independence could fully fill. Holidays were the worst. But every morning, I woke up in my tiny apartment, went to my job where no one called me worthless, built my life one brick at a time. 3 months after they left me at that rest stop, I checked my email one last time. A message from my mother. "Your grandmother is asking about you. Please, just let us know you're alive." I stared at it for a long time. Then I closed my email, deleted the account, and threw my old SIM card in the dumpster behind Sonny's. That night, Geraldine taught me how to make her famous apple pie. She watched as I kneaded the dough, nodding in approval. "You got good hand for pastry, kid," she muttered. It was the first real compliment I could remember getting in years. And I never looked back. Jacob's mugshot. 5 years after they left me at that Colorado rest stop, I found myself staring at a familiar face on my fake Facebook account. Jacob, or more accurately, Jacob's mugshot. He'd gotten a DUI, wrapped his car around a telephone pole. No one was hurt, except the pole. The local newspaper had used his old high school football photo, the one where he looked young and smug. Next to it was his bloated, tired-looking mugshot. That's the thing about karma. It moves at its own pace, but it never forgets an address. By then, my life was completely different. The tiny studio above the laundromat had been traded for a one-bedroom with actual windows. I'd worked my way up from dishwasher to prep cook to assistant manager at Sonny's. Geraldine still ran the place with an iron fist and a flour-dusted glove, but she'd started treating me like, I don't know, a weird nephew maybe. My first real purchase after I saved up some money? A laptop. Nothing fancy, just enough to take online classes, business management, accounting. The stuff my father, Marshall, always said was for people who couldn't do real work. I spent my mornings at Sonny's, my afternoons studying, my evenings back at work. Rinse and repeat. I won't pretend I wasn't still messed up from what happened. Trust issues? More like trust subscriptions I could cancel anytime someone got too close. I had exactly 2 friends in 5 years. My neighbor Doug, who played bass in a terrible garage band and sometimes brought me homemade beer that tasted like regret. And Geraldine, if she counted. That changed when Kendra walked into Sonny's. The girl who saw me. Kendra came in every Tuesday and Thursday like clockwork. Ordered the same thing. Denver omelet, no tomatoes, extra coffee. She always sat at the counter, completely zoned out in a medical textbook, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth for minutes at a time. I started timing her once. Record. 7 minutes and 23 seconds before she realized she was holding cold eggs. It took 4 months of me bringing her coffee refills before she actually looked up at me. And when she did, really looked, she blinked in surprise and said, "Your name tag is spelled wrong." It wasn't. But from then on, every Tuesday and Thursday, I wore a different name tag. Salvador. 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 Each time, she'd point it out, and I'd act surprised. Stupidest flirting in human history. But worked. Our first date wasn't even supposed to be a date. Her study group bailed last minute. She had a reservation at this impossible-to-get-into pizza place. I happened to be wiping down the counter when she got the cancellation text. Next thing I knew, I was sitting across from her at Antonio's, both of us realizing, at the same time, this looked exactly like a date. 6 months later, she moved into my apartment. A year later, we upgraded to a slightly bigger place. Nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom with a bathroom where the toilet didn't run constantly. And neighbors who didn't practice bass solos at 2 a.m. Meanwhile, I kept tabs on my family. Not proud of it, but there it is, watching from a distance. I follow my father's slow downfall through community Facebook groups. His hardware store struggled after a Home Depot opened nearby. I saw his bitter, desperate posts blaming corporate greed. My mother's social media turned into a weird shrine to family. Constant throwback pictures of us smiling. Post about how much she missed her boys, plural. She tagged Jacob, never me, like I'd been erased. Jacob bounced from job to job. Lots of vague booking about haters and new opportunities. The classic social media smokescreen for someone whose life was circling the drain. 3 years in, Geraldine took me aside during inventory. She was thinking about opening a second location. Asked if I wanted to run it. Not own it, just run it. I didn't sleep that night. Kept thinking it was a test. A joke. People like me didn't get opportunities like that. My father had made sure I understood that much. That's the thing about poisonous beliefs. They stay in your system long after you escape the snake. But I said yes. Because Kendra, half asleep beside me, mumbled, "You'd be stupid not to." Because Doug, through a haze of weed smoke, said, "Duh, you practically run the first place already." Because Geraldine wasn't my father, and she had never once made me feel like I was worthless. Sonny's East opened 6 months later. Smaller than the original. Different menu. My menu. I worked 90-hour weeks. Lost 10 pounds I couldn't afford to lose. Fought with Kendra about never being home. Came home to passive-aggressive post, "It's on the fridge," more than once. But worked. People came. And they came back. We weren't getting rich. But we were making it. For years after being abandoned, I made enough to help Kendra with her med school loans. Not all of them. Those things were monstrous. But enough to make a dent. She cried when I showed her the payment confirmation. Not movie crying. Real crying. Snotty, red-faced, hiccuping crying. And in that moment, for the first time in my life, I felt real. Then my grandmother died. A death in the family. I found out the way I found out everything about my family. Through Facebook. My mother had posted a long, dramatic tribute filled with a million heart emojis. Grandma Rose was the only one in the family who ever stood up to my father. The only one who ever truly saw me. She used to slip me $20 bills when no one was looking. "Save it for your escape," she'd whisper. I think she meant college. Turns out it was more literal than that. I thought about going to the funeral, even looked up flights. Kendra said she'd come with me, hold my hand through the whole awful reunion. Doug offered his crappy hatchback if I wanted to drive instead. Geraldine just shrugged. Dead people don't know if you're there or not. Do what brings you peace. I didn't go. Instead, I sent flowers. A generic sympathy arrangement. The card reads simply, Salvador. No return address. No note. Just my name. The explosion on social media was immediate. Mom posted about signs from beyond. Jacob made cryptic comments about prodigal sons. My father? Silent. But I could feel the storm behind closed doors. Then, a week later, I got a friend request from a name I didn't recognize. No posts. No friends. I almost deleted it until I saw the message. It's Uncle Rick. Your mom gave me your old email, but it bounced back. Are you okay? We've been worried. Your dad has been asking around about you. I blocked the account. That night, I had my first panic attack in 2 years. Sitting on our bathroom floor at 3 a.m., trying not to wake Kendra, trying to breathe through the feeling that my lungs were collapsing. Trying not to picture my father showing up at Sonny's, ripping apart everything I had built. An hour later, Kendra found me there. She didn't ask questions, just sat beside me, her shoulder pressing against mine. When I could finally breathe again, she whispered the simplest thing. They can't take anything from you that you don't give them. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Got advice on restraining orders, just in case. Tightened privacy settings on everything. Asked Geraldine to alert staff not to give out information about me. Practical steps. Control what you can control. 5 years to the day. 5 years to the day after they left me at that Colorado rest stop, I married Kendra. Small ceremony. Just close friends. Doug was my best man. Geraldine made the cake. Cried through the whole thing, mascara running down her wrinkled cheeks. Kendra's large, loud family adopted me instantly. Her dad told dad jokes that didn't make me flinch. Her mom hugged me without setting off alarms in my head. That's the thing about family. Sometimes it finds you when you stop looking. A week after the wedding, I saw it. Scrolling through my dummy account late at night. A post from my father. Looking for information on my son, Salvador. Last known location, Grand Junction, Colorado. Family emergency. There was no emergency. I knew that much. What I didn't know was why. After 5 years of nothing, they were suddenly looking for me. So I dug deeper. Created another fake account. Joined the community groups from my hometown. Pieced it together bit by bit. The hardware store had closed. The house was in foreclosure. My mother had vague booked about medical issues. Jacob had moved back home after his 3rd DUI. They weren't looking for me because they missed me. They were looking for me because they needed something. And you know what? For the first time in 5 years, I smiled. Not because I was happy about their misfortune, but because I realized something important. I didn't care anymore. I closed my laptop, crawled into bed next to my sleeping wife, and made a decision. I would keep watching from a distance. Not out of hate, not out of love, but because sometimes the best revenge isn't what you do. It's what you build while they're busy destroying themselves. 15 years later, the final test. It started with a LinkedIn notification. 15 years after that Colorado rest stop, my carefully constructed life had a glitch. Someone had viewed my profile 27 times. Not unusual. Recruiters did weird stuff like that. What was unusual was the name. Jacob Matthews. My brother. That's the thing about the past. It's patient. It will wait in the tall grass for years before it strikes. By then, my life looked nothing like it had at 22. Kendra had finished med school. Worked part-time at a local clinic, so she could be home with our kids more. We had 2 now. Ellie, 7. Marcus, 4. The tiny studio above the laundromat had given way to a modest 4-bedroom on the outskirts of town. Nothing fancy, but with a yard where the kids could play, where I could grow tomatoes that never quite turned out right. Sonny's had expanded to 3 locations. Still not some massive franchise, but enough that I didn't have to work the line anymore. Except when someone called in sick. Geraldine had semi-retired. still showed up unannounced to criticize our pie crust. I had made peace with my past. Or so I thought. The LinkedIn thing rattled me. 15 years of silence. And now this? I mentioned it to Kendra. She was folding laundry, mismatched socks in each hand. She paused. Are you okay? I nodded. Because what else could I say? That I suddenly felt like a 22-year-old again, stranded at a rest stop? That I could hear my father's voice in my head, calling me worthless? 3 days later, I was at Sunny's East, the original second location, helping with inventory. Maya, one of our servers, called from the front. Sal, some family's here asking for you. My first thought? Kendra's parents. They sometimes surprised us when they were passing through. I headed out, mentally preparing to convince them to stay for dinner. It wasn't Kendra's family. It was them. My father, my mother, Jacob, and a woman I didn't recognize, young, maybe early 20s, hanging back like she wasn't sure she belonged in this moment. Nobody spoke. The noise of the lunch rush seemed to fade away. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. Then my father said my name, like a question, and I nodded, face to face with the past. I'd imagined this moment 1,000 different ways over the years. In some versions, I told them off spectacularly. In others, I was cool and distant, completely unbothered by their existence. In a few embarrassing late-night scenarios, we even had a tearful reconciliation. Reality, as always, was messy, eh? I gestured to an empty table in the corner. Maya, can you bring some waters? Then I sat down across from the people who had once been my family. And I waited. 107 missed calls, 15 years too late. They found me through a magazine article. Rocky Mountain Rising, 10 local success stories. It wasn't even a big feature, just a sidebar. A picture of me standing in front of Sunny's with a short blurb about my journey from dishwasher to owner. Apparently, one of my mother's high school friends had moved to Colorado, seen it, and sent it to her with a cheerful, "Isn't this your son?" And just like that, the hunt began. 107 missed calls. That's how many they had made to my old number before it was disconnected. My mother had kept count. She mentioned it like it was supposed to mean something. They talked over each other, spinning their version of reality, where it was all just a misunderstanding, where they waited for me, but somehow couldn't find me, where they had been worried sick all these years. Jacob tried to play the friendly brother card, all awkward smiles and forced laughs. My father was more direct, his eyes scanning Sunny's like he was already calculating its worth. My mother just kept dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, her voice trembling. The young woman with them? Jacob's second wife, Poppy. She watched me with quiet curiosity, like she was really seeing me. I let them talk, let them tell their carefully constructed lies. And then, when they ran out of steam, I asked the only question that mattered. Why now? The truth comes out. The truth came in pieces. Between awkward pauses. Between sidelong glances and forced smiles. My father had medical bills. Heart problems. No insurance. The second house was in foreclosure. Jacob's latest business venture, some vague crypto scheme, had collapsed. My mother needed knee surgery she couldn't afford. They weren't here for reconciliation. They were here for money. I should have been angry, should have thrown them out on the spot. But instead, I felt something else. Pity. They looked so small, so desperate. These giants who had once controlled my whole world were just flawed, broken people. And I wasn't one of them anymore. The final goodbye. I invited them to dinner at my house. Said I needed to think, to talk to Kendra. They agreed eagerly. My father already halfway to considering it a done deal. That afternoon, I picked Ellie up from dance class, helped Marcus prepare for his preschool show and tell, all while texting Kendra updates. Her, do you want me to take the kids to my sister's? Me, no. I want them here. Her, are you sure? Me, yeah. Dinner was my specialty. Chicken enchiladas, which wasn't actually special, just a recipe from the back of an old El Paso box that I had tweaked over the years. Ellie set the table without being asked, carefully placing forks on the wrong side, until Kendra gently corrected her. Marcus insisted on wearing his Spider-Man costume, because it was Tuesday, and apparently, Tuesday was Spider-Man Day now. When the doorbell rang, I almost dropped the dish. Kendra squeezed my arm, whispered, "I've got your back." no matter what. The kids looked up, sensing something important was happening. That's the thing about moments you've dreaded for years. When they finally arrive, they're both worse and better than you imagined. The cost of a Greyhound ticket. Introductions were awkward. My father kept calling Kendra Karen, despite being corrected. My mother couldn't stop crying every time she looked at the kids, which freaked Marcus out. Jacob and Poppy were the least awful. Try to make actual conversation, though Jacob kept dropping hints about family helping family. After dinner, Kendra took the kids upstairs, giving me a look that clearly said, "Text if you need an extraction." It was just me and them, sitting in a living room that suddenly felt too small. My father started in on his pitch. How family sticks together. How he always knew I'd make something of myself. Lie. How they just needed a little help to get back on their feet. $20,000. Just a loan, of course. I let him finish. Then I asked him if he remembered what he said to me on my 18th birthday. He blinked. Blank. So I reminded him, "At least you can't disappoint me anymore once you're not legally my problem." I asked my mother if she remembered what she did when my father threw away my acceptance letter to community college. Nothing. She did nothing. I asked Jacob if he remembered telling my first girlfriend that I was probably gay anyway when she came looking for me after he convinced her I was cheating. He squirmed, made excuses. My father's eyes darkened, the old, familiar edge creeping into his voice, the one that used to make me shrink. But here's the thing. I wasn't shrinking anymore. I stood up, went to my office, came back with an envelope, handed it to my father. Inside was a check for $73.50. He stared at it, confused. What the hell is this supposed to be? I met his eyes. In 2010, a Greyhound ticket from Grand Junction to our hometown cost exactly $73.50. The exact amount it would have taken for me to get back home. From where you left me. Silence. Absolute silence. Then my father exploded. Called me ungrateful. Selfish. Said I'd always been a disappointment. The greatest hits album of my childhood, one last time. I didn't argue. Didn't shout back. Just stood up. It's time for you to leave. My mother tried guilt. Jacob went cold. His mask of friendly brother slipping entirely. Poppy just looked embarrassed for all of them. When they finally left, my father crumpled the check, threw it on our front step. I locked the door behind them and leaned against it, legs suddenly shaky. Kendra came downstairs. "Are you okay?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. We cleaned up the dishes in silence, checked on the kids, got ready for bed like it was any other night. As I set the security system, I pulled up the front door camera on my phone. They were still in the driveway, arguing. My father gesturing wildly. My mother crying. Jacob staring at our house, with an expression I recognized too well. Envy, mixed with hatred. Finally, they got in their rental car and drove away. The best revenge. I have never seen or heard from them again, and I don't expect to. That chapter is closed. That's the thing about revenge. The best kind isn't something you do. It's something you live. Every happy moment with my kids. Every inside joke with Kendra. Every quiet Sunday morning with nothing to fear. Every single, ordinary day in a life built on my terms. I never made it back home. I did something better. I built one. Ban Danoi? Continue. Chat Danoi? That was the final part of the story. The conclusion, the closure, the last word. There is nothing left to continue. He won. He built a life on his own terms. He found love, purpose, peace, things his family could never take from him. His revenge wasn't rage. It wasn't some dramatic confrontation. It was success, stability, happiness. The best revenge is a life well lived. And he lived it. Story complete. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe for more real-life family dramas. Let me know in the comments what you think about today's story. Was it fair or totally messed up? See you in the next one.